to our second of two parallel sessions today, and sadly our penultimate event of the conference this year. My name is Rensimer. I'm based at UCL Institute of Education, and I'll be chairing this session. So we have an exciting pair of presentations in this session, both with an internationally comparative approach. The first presentation will be by Vincent Carpentier. He's a reader at UCL IOE, and he's a co-investigator for CG's Project 7, a historical lens on higher education staffing, UK and France, which he'll be sharing with us today. The second presentation will be by Simon Marginson, Professor of Higher Education at University of Oxford and CG Director, you may have heard of him, and Elisa Brewis, CG Research Associate at Oxford, currently working on CG's Project 8, entitled Local and Global Public Good of Higher Education, a 10-nation study, which they'll be sharing some findings from today. So in terms of the structure of the session, we'll have two separate presentations and Q&A. So we'll hear first from Vincent, and then open up to the audience for questions, after which we'll hear from Simon and Elisa and follow with questions for them. So as the presenters are speaking, please post your questions in the chat or indicate to me that you have a question. After the presentation, I'll call your name so you can ask the question directly, or if for whatever reason you're unable to, I'll relay your question to the speakers. Okay, so enough from me. Vincent, over to you if you're ready to begin.
Thank you. Thank you, Lee. I'm going to share my slide. Here we go. Can you see it? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, now I need. Okay, so very pleased to be able to share my my first findings on this project on staffing in higher education in France and the UK. So bear with me because it's still work in progress, but I think it's a great time to share that with you and get some feedback from colleagues. So briefly, the objectives of this project is to explore the evolution of a number and the kind of various structures of HE workforce in France and the UK. This is Project 7 of the Transition Center. And the objective is to make some link with socioeconomic fluctuation, to look since the 1920s about how the HE workforce in both countries has evolved. There's a link between this project and the past CG project I had, which was based on the expansion and differentiation of HE system. And this current project is about to link those data on student and institution about the expansion and differentiation of HE system to those of the HE workforce. I've got like quite three complementary perspectives to look at HE workforce, like a more general one, which is the labor capital kind of relationship in general in societies. Then the question of the public sector and what kind of resources, policy, staff policy happen in the public sector. And the third one is about the specificities of the HE sector within the public sector. I will focus today more on the third one, because what I want to do is to give you some context on how the HE workforce evolved around time. My approach is about combining history and political economy. My view of political economy is about like this kind of interaction of complementary and competing logics. It can be economic, political, social, cultural, regarding education, and that's one of my angles. And by history, I mean reasoned use of history. I think that we can learn from lessons from history. I don't think it repeats itself, but I think it's important to look at the past in a way. What I'm going to present are mostly quantitative data about the HE workforce in the 1920s, but based on new data sets. So I'm still like collecting data in both countries. The idea for me, and that's very important, is like I try to explore trends and patterns, but of course this should be seen in complementary, I like complementing qualitative study, because it's about the number and the structure of staff, but not about experiences and that a lot of colleagues have been talking about in policy, like for example Marini, Locke, and Whitchurch, and another CG project. Comparative aspect of a project for me is very important, but France and the UK are very different systems. So the idea of my quantitative history is to find some commonalities and differences, but it's nearly impossible to find like a straight comparison of the two countries. So the structure of my talk would be to talk a little bit about the debates in France and the UK about staffing in higher education. Then to look at the context of higher education, and in that I'm going to look at some of the results from the previous project that gives an idea about the structure, the system in which HE workforce lives, work, and teach and research. Then I will talk about the expansion of the workforce since 1920s, the question of institutional differentiation, working condition, and then the representativeness of the HE workforce. Okay, so briefly, because I've got only 15 minutes or 10 minutes left now, the French context, there's been an historical kind of evolution over the years from a very highly centralized recruitment from the Napoleonic time, to some changing in around 1879, where people like Musselin are talking about configuration universitaire, which is actually the share of the process of recruitment around discipline between the academic profession on the one hand and the state, and they both manage the system. What happened like recently, especially since 2009 in France, is more autonomy from institution, and what appear is a kind of new emerging stratification of the academic profession, which is not based as it was before between professor and lecturer, but more on between permanent and non-permanent staff, and also the expansion of academic management. So the current debates in France at the moment are first about the idea of staff-student ratio and the resources, and especially the lack of resources, especially in university. There's been two particular kind of reforms. Loi Programmation Recherche will propose more resources, but at the same time, is developing more competition within the academic system in France, which has led to strikes from the union. There's also the introduction of junior professor, which is the introduction of tenure track French style, which is a big change compared to usual to the way HE worked in France. So there's some controversial reform at the moment in France. In the UK, you've got a more decentralized system. You had like what was called like a binary system before between the public sector and the university sector. We had like different ways of regulating staff in higher education. Question of institutional economy, but you've got, as in France, debates on casualization, teaching and research assessment, and tensions between autonomy on the one side and increased regulation. There's been recent also strikes on pay, graduation, equality, and workload. So in both countries, you've got some quite like tense debates about the future of the academic work. So what I want to propose is just like to start with 3 slides, like 3 kind of what I think are important contextual things to reflect on, to understand the evolution of the academic workforce historically. The first one is the development of the key expansion of the system, and you can see from these 2 graphs that both systems has expanded greatly over the years with some fluctuation, but at the same time, what is important is both systems have expanded through processes of differentiation. So in the UK, that was driven by a binary system in the 1960s. And then a second expansion was driven by a unified system. But what's important as well, and it's important to understand how the debates on the academic workforce, is some vertical differentiation remained even after unification in 1992, leaving still to have in the vocabulary this idea of post-92 institution, pre-92 institution, and then constitution of groups like the Russell Group of research intensive university. An important thing as well for the debate today is like the recent trend in the UK has been like slower growth of expansion since 2010 in some ways, but also an expansion of the Russell group. So you've got an expansion of this kind of, as enrollment slowed down, you've got the expansion of the Russell group, which is quite important to understand. In France, you've got the tripartite system. Expansion is driven by universities, but also increasingly by grandes écoles and two-year provision. Like in the UK, as in the UK, the differentiation is institutional differentiation has also led to a social stratification. So it's important to realize that there are like very kind of social stratification of students according to the various kind of type of institution. And the university is the widening participation, let's say, kind of institution. But in relation to the expansion of the system, the recent trend in France is quite interesting and different from the UK. There's been like a demographic pressure since 2010 in France, which had put pressure mainly on universities. And that's important to understand as well the tension that this led to in relation to the academic workforce. The second important element is the transformation of the income structure. And I'm not going to go into detail, but I mean, this graph is quite clear in some ways. And then you've got this idea of a turning point in 1973, where you've got like the radical changes in the income structure of income in the UK, but also, as you can see, in red, in France as well. So reduction of public funding around the time. And you've got this movement of public underfunding in France and introduction of cost sharing and even a movement of public-private substitution in the UK. So there's tension in relation to funding and transformation of the structure of funding. The third contextual slide is about the HE system and this idea that in both countries, you've got some unequal resources across the various kind of institutions. And although you've got an overall increase of spending per student over the years, over a period, you've got persistent inequality. That was the case in the binary system in the 1980s. And you can see from the graph below, which is about the UK, that unification tends to stop that trend in some ways and to reduce the gap in relation to resources. But the gap was widened again after policial marketization. In France, you can see that there's been like a kind of stable, kind of unequal distribution of resources according to a various kind of element. And clearly the universities, as you can see, are under-resourced compared to the other institutions. Okay, so now that we've seen like this contextual element, I mean, how does the HE workforce evolve in both countries? You can see from the figure at the top that the expansion of HE system and the workforce, they experience in a way some similar trends, but at different rates. And what you can see also is, first of all, that the number, I mean, the size of the HE workforce, but also the staff-student ratio, which is the graph at the bottom, in the UK are twice as big as in France. So there's a big difference in relation to the size, but also the the staff-student ratio between the UK and France. What you can see from the graph below, which is the number of staff per 100 students, is clearly some turning point, and especially the one in 1976 in both countries. You've got the first expansion of the 1960s, which continue to develop with high staff-student ratio, and the 1970s, in a way, is a turning point where staff-student ratio start to decrease. Interestingly, in the UK, you've got like an increase of a staff-student ratio up to 22. It's important to take on board the fact that at the time, enrollment is diminishing, so it's not necessarily a growth of the HE workforce that is experienced. In France, the staff per student ratio is stable over the whole period in some ways, as you can see. And after 2010, you can see like a decline which is actually underfunding and stable staff recruitment in the context of the demographic boom I was talking about earlier. I wanted to talk about two things here. First, institutional differentiation in the workforce. So you've got two things I wanted to mention here. The first is the link between the staff-student ratio and income per student. And maybe it's not surprising, but clearly you can see in both graphs, so the one at the top is about the UK and the one at the bottom is about France. You've got like the spending per student line, which is very close to the staff per student ratio evolution. And you've got like a similar kind of evolution. Again, 1970s, the crisis 1970 is a turning point where both staff student ratio and income per student start decreasing in some ways. Again, you've got the same mechanism where student staff per ratio is reduced by the unification in the UK and increased again after the movement of marketization. The recent reduction in the gap remains significant. What's important as well is, as the income per student, you've got some big differences between the various kind of type of organization. And especially you can see like a big difference between the Russell Group and the post-92 university, which are the ex-polytechnics. In France, the staff-student ratio of university is consistently lower than the rest of the system. So behind the idea of a student-staff ratio is really important to disaggregate this. Another kind of key trend I wanted to talk about is this idea of permanent staff, atypical staff in both countries. And what you can see is that in France, you've got a share of non-permanent staff decreased after the mid-1970s and then remained stable at 15%, around 50% in 1986. The proportion of non-personal staff in the UK is far higher than in France, and you also must add like what is called atypical staff as well. Part-time staff is limited in France. In the UK, it's really notable that you've got a strong increase since the early 2000s, nearly a third of the workforce in part-time work today. And also you can see from the figure in the bottom that this is highly differentiated, and again, like a big difference between, for example, Russell Group and post-92 university. Then the idea of representation of the HE workforce is very important, and that's something I'm working on at the moment. Especially, I'm trying to work on ethnicity. I'll go back in history as well and to see the figures. But if you look at gender here, you can see that is a mix of progress, but also persistent inequality. Again, it's about quantitative data, not about access. So it's important to take that on board. You can see from here, there's an underrepresentation at professional level in both countries. That's the two lines at the bottom. And the idea as well that women are more represented in part-time jobs. So just to finish, because I know I'm late, the idea that you've got turning points, which are the 1973 and 2008 crises. You've got public underfunding in both countries, which produced two different kinds of tension in each system. The tension in the French system has been well identified by Barry and Picard, the tension between a vision of HE as a national egalitarian and unified public service, which is in tension with the increasing differentiation of the jobs position. In the UK, the tension is within a marketized system around distribution of resources, student experiences, and staff development. So one idea is that a reversal of public-private substitution is needed to rebalance HE expansion and develop a fair process of institutional differentiation. And this should be based on the reduction of inequalities in resources, and that includes staff development. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Vincent. That was it's a really interesting, I think, and rewarding retrospective on the development of academic staffing and the general trends in these two contexts. I think it tells it's a vital part of the story for understanding and engaging in contemporary debates on HE workforce and the future. So looks like we're waiting for some questions to come in. We have one that just came in from Jenny Case. So I'd like to invite Jenny to present her question.
There, I'm unmuted. That was a very, really interesting presentation. And I would like to sit with those graphs magnified for a few hours to try and understand what's there. But I was trying to get the big picture, and maybe particularly, it's interesting to have your talk because we've just had something on student loans. And, you know, Paul Ashman asked the question there, you know, what do you propose for the system to be different? So I'm really fascinated by your macro data on the spending in higher education, given these times of enormous change. And firstly, just correct me, because this is my quick take homes across your graphs. In absolute numbers, in both countries, the spending's gone up. Of course, student enrollments in both countries have gone up. But I was interested that your spending per student is not totally, you know, declining as I had sort of assumed in these countries, given that students themselves are now contributing a lot. I mean, in some ways, higher education is just becoming more expensive. We're all, I think students and their families are even anticipating a certain kind of quality. We would like academic salaries. I want to give you a question and maybe just correct me. Are my take homes entirely wrong? You know, are you sort of, is this a pushback to say, you know, these are not governments, these two countries are not disinvested in higher education. And given all the other pressures on public funding, it's kind of interesting that the investment has grown. Please correct me, because I might have taken the wrong thing from those graphs, trying to follow the different things. And then, yeah, we have to have a much longer conversation. But that's maybe a version of a question, the best I could come up with now. But just to say, very exciting to see your work.
Thank you, Jenny. Thanks a lot. So, I mean, there's probably three things, like spending per student at some point is also, in the case of the UK, because there's been like a decrease of a number of students after 2012 for a while, that had an impact on the spending per student. And that, had, you know, it's partly explained, but only partly. The other thing is like spending per student is going up, but it's the spending or the income per student is public and private, and that's the private share of you know, that have increased and that like have provided like the most resources. Which raise an issue in relation to what you mentioned with Claire's presentation about the, I mean, first the effect on access and the effect on depth also, and raise the question as well of the, you know, I've raised this idea of public-private substitution in that case, but also the idea, there's a key idea that in some ways, because of a loan system, it may be actually deferred public spending rather than private, because some of the loans are not going to be refunded in some way. So, you know, one could ask the question why it's not like upfront public funding rather than, you know, deferred one. And the other thing is with spending per student, there's a lot of there's huge differences between the kind of institution we're talking about. So the group of institutions and also individual institutions. So yeah, I mean, if you look at the spending per student, it progresses, not as much as you would think, because there's some public element, private element, but also it depends also on the enrollment of students, which has been slowing down for a while and is now back over the last 2 or 3 years. Thank you.
Well, so Jenny followed up with a clarification about whether the private share funding is included in those figures.
Yeah, it is.
It is. Okay. Yeah.
It is.
Okay. I have to agree with Jenny that, I mean, those charts are fascinating, and I could similarly stare at them all day and pick out trends that I'd love to ask you about. I suppose there's a question about the data. itself, I wanted to ask you, first of all, where do you get your data from, and does it allow you to go subnationally? Because I mean, the trends that you present are fantastic at the national level. Does it allow you to pick apart the institutional differences, say in the post 92s and these things in the UK context?
Yeah. I mean, I had to do it myself in some ways because you don't have so you have to reconstruct what are post 92 and pre 92. But yeah, that's been I've been quite busy with doing this, reconstructing, what are the kind of different group of institutions. But you have this data exists at the institutional level. So what I do is I aggregate them to, but you can find it at the institutional level without any problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm.
France is a bit more institutional level is possible as well, yeah, but a bit more difficult to get the data.
Mm. Okay, and we're actually I'll hold my conversation here because there's a question here from Manshi. Manshi, would you like to go ahead?
Hi, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Vincent, very much. Thank you for such a rich and very insightful presentation. I have a question about internationalization of higher education in general. So basically, in your study, you mentioned that there is a relatively higher staff-student ratio in the UK than in France, and also a relatively larger portion of the non-permanent positions in the UK. And I noticed that your study looked at the period of time when the internationalization of higher education is a big trend during the past few decades, particularly for English-speaking countries like the UK. So I would like to hear your thoughts about so the mobility of the staff and students, how this trend plays a role in the trends that highlighted in your study. Thank you.
Thank you, Manchi. In relation to international staff, I mean, I had the data yesterday, and I don't want to give you a figure. I know that the UK is very high compared to other countries. It's probably at 15% or something like that, I would say. But in relation to international students, you've got about 23% of students are international, like EU, non-EU in relation. So a lot of this, even the spending, the income I was talking about, because of the differences as well in fee level, explain, internationalization, explain a lot of the trends, I was talking about in relation both to income and to enrollment. So 20% probably of enrollment, something like that, and a little, about the same in relation to income and large proportion of fees in some way. So yeah, I mean it's compared to France, it's the internationalization dynamic is far more important. Although France has just introduced fees for international students to about 3,000 euros, I think, or maybe a bit more last year. So France is slowly getting into cost sharing, which may have implications as well in relation to this. And the proportion of international staff in France is less important than in the UK.
Okay, that's really interesting. It doesn't look like we have other questions at the moment, so I thought maybe if we go to Simon and Elisa, and then if we have time at the end, we can find some questions that bridge the two talks. So thank you very much, Vincent. And then we'll move over now to Simon and Elisa.
Well, thanks, Lee. The project, Public Good Project's in its 7th year. It's a very large and ambitious project, which has largely executed its data gathering process, but has got a long way to run, I think, on its analysis and writing up stages. It's been supported by 3 different postdocs, research associates. Aline Courtois was with the project for the first 14 months, and that she was the only postdoc we had on the project in the first 5-year period, although we had a PhD student, Lily Yang, who was doing a particular project within the project. Lily then became the postdoc for the first 14 months of the Transition Centre, and subsequently went to HKU, where she has a lecturing position, although she's continuing to work on some of this stuff. And we've now got Eliza with us, and Eliza's with us for, I think, a total of 19 months to the end. So we've had this interesting relationships, and I think as a result, different emphases in different periods. But we've, as I said, completed 9 of the 10 case studies, with the US postponed because of the pandemic, and perhaps will never be done, and 2 more data collection sets from Australia and Russia as well, which are parallel to the main project. So we've effectively got 11 countries in terms of our interview data. And we've also got the majority of an annotated bibliography in related literature, which I expect we'll be able to finish in this calendar year. And the final year of the project will be spent doing, pulling the comparisons together and then integrating the data as a whole. The project began from a critique of the orthodox economic understanding of public good and public goods generated in higher education in the Anglophone countries. And the economic model, which, as you all know, shapes higher education policy and financing, centres the definition of higher education on solely individual private goods, has a narrow idea of the private benefits, mostly focusing on graduate earnings and employment rates, and downplays collective goods and global goods. And those, as a result, in this framework, are largely unidentified and unfinanced. Now, we felt that a better theorisation of public goods in higher education was needed. And one way to do this was to compare, and where possible, to combine the approach taken in different political cultures. Now, stage 1 of the public good project, largely completed, as I said, is national case studies. Interviews in 2 universities per country and in government. These have been conducted and written up for China, Japan, France, Poland, and Chile. And Vincent played a significant role as one of the researchers in this project and conducting the casework in France with Hélène Courtois and writing a really good paper, which has been published in Compare out of that data set. We've also conducted, but not yet written up, the cases in South Korea, Finland, Canada, and UK. Let me acknowledge Olga Munn, who conducted very good interviews for us in South Korea and Finland, and Tom Brotherhood in Canada. We also have parallel data sets, as I said, for Russia and Australia. And in addition, we worked with 2 researchers, one from Poland and the other from Chile, who completed interviews in those countries. And we helped the Chile study arrange its internal financing, and Poland was self-financing as well. Stage 2 is comparison. And so far, we've done a lot of work on the China Anglo-America comparison, which is the topic of Lily Yang's doctoral study. In fact, there's been a vast output from that particular study. Lily's book will come out in Bloomsbury fairly soon. There's been a number of journal papers, and I've done some joint work with Lily, which we've, and particularly a long paper, about 18,000 word paper published in Globalization, Society and Education, which triggered a debate and a discussion with 6 commentaries on that paper published by the journal. And there's also been a spin-off, and we've started looking at tianxia as a concept for understanding the global space. And Xin Chu and Lily and I are just finalising a paper for Globalization, Societies and Education. There's also a version in Chinese as well. Stage 2 also includes, and this is pretty interesting, lexical studies, lexical comparisons of key terms, translation issues. And we've done that extensively now for Chinese and English. And Eliza is working on Finnish. She's a native Finnish speaker, and she will talk about that work today. We also hope to complete it for Japan and France, and possibly for Spanish and Polish as well. I'm still negotiating that now. Stage 3 of the project, which is very challenging, will be to integrate the findings about the public good role of higher education in the different countries across the study. And we hope to develop a common conceptual framework which will allow us to define and discuss the outcomes of higher education across all areas and now that to try and devise a common conceptual framework out of these different languages and different findings about emphasis and so on is, of course, extremely challenging. But we did make quite a lot of progress with that, with the China and English comparison in the Globalization, Societies and Education article. I'll have more to say about that when we report further in a year's time. Now, let me just take you into some of the conceptual terrain we're in. Now, let's start with the discourse that's most familiar to most of us, the dominant Anglo-American ideas about public. Well, there's three notions. Firstly, the zero-sum dualism, public is separate from and opposed to private, public versus private, I call it. The second notion is the normative idea of the public good as a kind of universal good thing, common beneficence or benefit, common state. And no one can disagree with that, but it's rather normative and it's vague. The third notion is the broad-based inclusive idea of public that's suggested by the term public opinion or public media. Now, this, like the zero-sum dualism, the economic dualism of public and private, has its ultimate origins in the 18th century, but I think not out of Adam Smith and his desire to limit the role of the state. It comes out of the French Revolution and the great public spaces that were created in the French Revolution, and how that, of course, has underpinned, the Western democratic tradition. Now, this third dimension of the inclusive public, I think is underplayed a bit in our discussion, but it actually connects quite a lot to higher education and certainly to knowledge. This idea of a large community that's networked by universal communication. So public-private dualism is the one used to justify tuition fees in higher education in the UK. And it's the implication is that higher education in its character, in its nature, in its social nature, must be either public or private. To the extent that it generates private benefits for graduates, it's less public, so that it should be financed privately rather than publicly. Now, this suggests that there are few public benefits that need to be supported publicly. The reasoning is quite normal now and part of our political system in the Anglophone countries, but many other countries don't think this way. They don't see the zero-sum dualism at all. Now, the Anglophone public-private split takes two forms. One is economic. Classically, Paul Samuelson's 1954 paper. Private goods are produced in markets, public goods are produced by government or philanthropy. Now, the other meaning, which is also in common usage, is the juridical political meaning, and sort of ownership meaning, you might call it. The private sphere is the home or civil society or the market. The public sphere is the state, and what's public is what's owned or perhaps what's controlled by the state. Now, when you combine the economic dualism and the political dualism, you get this sort of rather crude version that runs through the Anglophone political systems, which is a sort of state and market dualism. This is, I say it's crude because it creates an incoherence, an internal incoherence. Because in a neoliberal setting, governments actually foster and manage markets. I mean, markets are not separated from the state. There are state-managed markets, quasi-markets in education and elsewhere. And on the other hand, much of the private sphere activity is non-market in character, classically the household. I mean, another problem is that and probably this is the kind of, if you like, the weak underbelly of the dualism. The public-private dualism excludes the possibility that higher education could increase both the private good and the public good at the same time. That is, that they may not be zero-sum. And on some interpretations, for example, you can argue that the private benefit lies in the extension of the public benefit. The public gains by the private sphere having more benefits rather than less from higher education. That enriches the public benefits as well, and so on. And that they can provide conditions for each other, and they're otherwise, quite positively related rather than necessarily zero sum. So You know, the idea that you have to set the public against the private is, as I said, I think the weak underbelly of the Anglophone approach. Now, what we got interested in, I think, in the China English language comparison was the role of the communicative inclusive public, because it's this element which is sort of missing to some extent in the Chinese civilizational tradition, which has a weaker idea of the civic and civil space and a stronger idea of the state and the role of the state compared to all of the Euro-American traditions. Now, the communicative inclusive public does not set the public interest or benefit against the private interest or benefit, and they can foster each other. I think this kind of public, which resonates especially strongly with Western European democratic traditions, we can understand is associated with participative spaces, public media, social assemblies, either the electorate as a sort of unified community, and it also connects to the Habermasian idea of the public sphere. And the UNESCO notion of education for the common good has embraced to some extent this notion of a relational public based on democratic principles. Now, it's interesting to think about what this implies or means for equality in a democratic context, because in some kinds of relational public, in this sense, everyone's equal. I mean, the one vote, one value in the electorate is a clear manifestation of the idea of universal equality. But this public communicative realm is also rather dominated by private media and now private social media and platforms. And so clearly it's asymmetrical in terms of who holds power. I mean, some interests, some organizations and some individuals exercise a great deal of power in this public communicative space, and others are less powerful. So it's not unproblematic, especially in the context of the rise of social media as partly replacing older styles of democratic politics. Well, how can we understand the contributions of higher education to the global good? Another problem, the good of the world as a whole and all its components. Well, there's no global state, so you can't read the public good in the economic sense as proceeding as a kind of spillover from the market. There is a global market of a kind, but there's no, in different spheres, but there's no global state. So the sort of classic Samuelson economic formula for deriving the nature of the public doesn't really work very well at the global level. But there is a kind of communicative relational public at the global level, and the UNESCO notion of global common good, I think, is based on some sort of notion of world community. Although it's all a bit woolly and vague, isn't it, in the way in which it's formulated. Now, I've quickly run you through a set of Western and primarily Anglo-American ideas. And of course, this is one starting point for comparing all of the other jurisdictions, all of the other countries. But it's important to remember that this is only one possible starting point, and you can start from another tradition and then look at all the others from there. And then you get a somewhat different set of emphases and results. I mean, all of the notions of public or the equivalent in other languages, or nearest equivalent, because it's not simple, and public good. I mean, all of those notions rest on a particular kind of state and a particular political culture. And political cultures vary a lot. And this is one of the things that shapes variations in the role of universities and other higher education institutions. Political culture really is a key variable at world level. I mean, the Western or especially Euro-American version of political culture has a state where there's an internal division of powers between executive, legislature, and judiciary. There's the semi-autonomy of other public institutions like universities. There's the overarching separation of the state from the market and from civil society. They're all kind of distinct in some way. The Chinese tradition, comprehensive state, everything is included inside the state, all of the provinces, all of the communities, all of the villages, all of the families, all of the individuals in some sense are nested in this very large state sphere. Of course, the state sits within the world sphere, which is Chanxia. Chinese tradition has deep devolution in specific sectors, but there's not the same division of powers or real autonomy in terms of independence that you get in the Western tradition. So the state is never absent from the question of the public or the public good or the collective good in the Chinese tradition. And the Chinese tradition runs through the whole of East Asia. I mean, it's not a Leninist tradition, it's a Sinic tradition going back to the Zhao dynasty and before, about 3,000 years old, this sort of comprehensive state. So, I mean, it changes the way you see it. And you can also look at it in terms of the Nordic state, where you've got the equation of state and society in some sense, but also a very pronounced democratic tradition in the modern period as well, different from the Sinic civilizational zone in that respect. So, you know, and different approach to communicative public in particular. But again, interestingly, both the Chinese civilizational tradition and the Nordic traditions don't really like the public-private dualism and the economic view that it's either a public benefit or a private benefit, and you've got to choose between the two, and you only finance it if it's a public benefit. So, you know, that's salutary, isn't it? When we combined the Chinese tradition and the Anglo-American tradition, we found we could develop a framework, conceptual framework, which included everything in both traditions, providing we didn't use the public-private dualism. Once you use that, you exclude a whole lot of outputs, basically, from view. So that is really a problem in the Anglo-American tradition, but I guess you probably knew that anyway. But, you know, the point is that we're trying to achieve this comparison and integration without reducing diversity. And that's a tremendously exciting intellectual problem, really difficult, but I think we're making progress. If we can do it across the English-speaking and China divide, I think France, Poland, Finland, you know, Chile are going to be easier in some respects than that. So we'll take it from here, and I'll hand over to Eliza at this point. And I will stop screen sharing.
Thank you, Simon. So just to be clear, I'm not going to present a summary of all of the research findings from the Finnish case study, but I am going to present, highlight or illustrate some of those key points that Simon mentioned in his talk just now. So the first point is about the lexical comparison, and then I'll look at the importance of the political state, and then just illustrate what this process of coming up with a comprehensive and inclusive theoretical framework looks like. So in Finland, it's really helpful to look at the concept of the sivistys yliopisto. Sivistys roughly translates as civilization, and is familiar to perhaps to most of the audience. It's something similar to the Humboldtian university mission from the context of Germany. So the first thing to say is, can we translate private good, public good, common good into Finnish? Well, kind of. Private good, we have these economic terms from the discipline of economics, yksityishyödyke, and then public good, julkishyödyke. Hyödyke coming from the root noun hyöty, meaning benefit, advantage, or profit. So we do have a translation for it. However, where do you see these words used? Mainly in economics and public policy papers. If you look in databases of Finnish scholarship, mostly used in the context of forestry and agriculture, public policy, or economic public policy. However, these terms really do not have much political or socio-cultural significance, not much relevance to the higher education debate. So when people debate higher education in Finland or justify why we have no tuition fees and why we have free study grants from the government, you do not hear this tension between yksityishyödyke or julkishyödyke. And in addition, we don't actually have a word for common good either. There is no consensus on what a translation of this word would be in Finland. So let me just share an example from the interview data. I think in the Finnish context, the term public good and private good are not necessarily easy to translate, because in a society where still the trust is very much described with the relationship between individuals, the relationship between institutions and society, the relationship between business companies. In this kind of context, the making a difference between what is private good, meaning how I benefit from higher education personally, or what is public good, how the societies or communities benefit from higher education, it's not relevant. These are not categories in conflict, they're more like intertwined. So if we go back to those three pictures, those images that Simon had of, the signpost, the dualism, the universe, the normative values, and then the communicative network, we could see in Finland something more similar to the network relational approach. Now, it's quite something if you're doing a research project, right, for the interview participant to say, well, this is not relevant. Great, okay. So why are we asking this research question, right? So the next step is to think, well, what is relevant in the context of Finland? So here I would like, sorry, for some reason I'm not able to go to the next slide. So here I would like to show you just a whistle-stop tour of Finnish history of what is the meaning of sivistysyliopisto and how this is actually used in the context of Finland, excuse me, to describe the mission of universities and their contribution to the public good. So sivistys roughly translates as civilization, but it's more about that. It's maybe perhaps more similar to Bildung in German. So in the pre-1800s, pre-independence era, we can see how the word takes on these new meanings. And here in the early 1800s, it comes to symbolize enlightenment. These are two prominent figures of the nationalist movement in Finland at the time, Johan Snellman and Elias Lönnrot. And Snellman in particular was inspired by the example of the Humboldtian University in Berlin, and proposes a model for Finnish universities, the sivistysyliopisto, we could call it the civilizing university. And these are even referred to kind of in the way that Humboldtian University is referred to as the Snellmanian University, named after this particular politician and nationalist. And you can see what's happening here is the very mission of universities, the purpose of education is intertwined with the nationalist movement, with the project of emancipation from foreign powers. It's about the Finnish nation becoming independent, removing social injustices and social inequalities. So I actually did my doctoral study on Indonesia. It's a country I'm very familiar with. And when I look at the current legislation in Finland, I'm actually very much reminded of many post-colonial contexts where you have constitutions, legal provisions which are enshrining this right of, education is given this role to sort of overcome injustices of a colonial era. So in the most recent Universities Act, we can still see evidence of this sivistysyliopisto still alive. So for example, the Universities Act describes the mission in this way: to provide research-based higher education and to educate students to serve their country and humanity at large, to promote lifelong learning, interact with the surrounding society, and promote the social impact of university research findings and artistic activities. So you can see how in this context, this dualism between public and private is not relevant, as the interview participant mentioned. I'm sorry, I've just skipped a huge chunk of Finnish history, and as a former history undergraduate, it grates me to do this, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move to the summary. So as Simon said, it's a very interesting, intellectually stimulating project to try and think of this alternative framework. So again, I have an interview quote from one of the interview participants explaining the meaning of sivistys. Education and culture, which means that we are not only educating society in a formal way, but also making the culture livelier. So we get people who know things in a technical sense, but they also have good values in their mind. So they have education in mind and in heart. You lift the society to a different level, like a higher level, which is something you can't measure, but you get a country where the values are good, which is taking global responsibility and acting good on average in a big picture. So try to think of a diagram, a way of expressing the contribution of higher education to public good in the Finnish context. Maybe something like a nested model makes more sense. So private good is not in conflict with the public good, it's just one of the things contained within it. And also interview participants, they see there that a national level contribution to public good can have a sort of trickle-on effect to the international global level as well. The slides do mention some English language texts if you would like to look at the history of the Finnish higher education system in more detail, where you can look, you can see more about the welfare state. Please refer to those documents there as well. So just to come back to the original points made by Simon, political context really matters. This lexical approach is very fruitful because it forces you to think about other perspectives. And in an international research team, you end up learning about different perspectives and different ways of articulating these things. And finally, working towards an integrative, inclusive framework is quite is tricky but rewarding, and takes a lot of work. And personally, I'm very much inspired by the work of Xin Shu, who in that Globalization, Societies and Education journal special edition that Simon mentioned, she's written an article where she talks about being different together as a framework for cross-cultural comparative education research. So in the interest of time, I'll end there, but happy to answer more questions on the Finland case in more detail. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Simon. Thank you, Elisa, both. This is a fascinating discussion here. We already have some questions coming in, and the first is from Jenny. Jenny, would you like to go ahead?
Is that me? I think there are others up there, aren't there as well? Sorry,
I think there's some comments from Simon. There's some discussion here, which I thought we'd come back to. Unless, Simon, did you want to touch on those points?
There's someone called Pete. I don't know who that is. Seems to be ahead of me in the chat. Don't want to jump the queue.
I would take Jenny, perhaps not. I mean, my little battle with Pete can go on at any time.
Okay, I don't mind. I don't mind just pitching in here because I really found this an amazing presentation, Simon and Elisa. I know I've got the pronunciation wrong. And just sort of think, like I wouldn't want to live in that very nested society, I guess, because I've been brought up in this different worldview. But I wonder, and maybe it's particular as Finnish interview comments that made me think, do all our existential angst, critical debates around higher education, are they a feature of our worldview? And it makes me think of how people write higher education studies in the rest of the world, and they come forward with less angst. I don't know, Simon. And that seems like a ridiculous question, but it seems fascinating, and I partly feel attracted to living in a nested place and being less angsty.
Well, I think that's absolutely right, that insight. And, you know, the English-speaking, the Anglophone framework, you know, dominated by the limited liberal state in this particularly sharp reading that Samuelson created in policy economics, you know, where he said market and state are sort of different worlds, and, you know, public and private falls along the market, non-market boundary and so on. And that is not shared by the rest of the world. And it's one of the ways in which orthodox Anglo-American neoclassical economics is unable to comprehend education. It just doesn't understand the production that education constitutes. It's an unusual sector, you know, but maybe you find the same problem with public health to some extent, you know, but what we do in education isn't basically, it falls outside economics. I mean, most of non-market services do, you know, it's a fundamental problem. So we spend all of our time combating this and critiquing it and dealing with the outcomes of this framing of our work. And some of us make entire careers on being critics of this framework. I mean, I'm sure it's been central to my career. The fact that I was able to articulate that critique, you know, gave me a role with my peers. And I think that's true of many of us, actually, in one way or another. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm saying if we hadn't been encumbered with this problem of having to try and fight our way out of this box that things like, you know, public, private, and employability create, then we'd be able to get on with a lot of other things, and we'd be able to foreground the positive value of what we're doing and join up to others in society, you know, work on a partnership basis to make education and society better much more effectively. It's a bit of a disaster. It sort of pushes us back into this defensive, negative role all of the time. So I like the Finnish model, you know, and I think the Chinese model on education is better as well.
Can I add to that? not to burst your bubble. I have these, so I'm half Finnish. It's kind of easier to do it perhaps. So I find myself in conversations in international settings where everybody is sort of enamored by this Finnish utopian ideal. And then yes. I sort of come in and say, hey, we actually have some social inequality too. We have problems with gender inequality in the academic profession. And we have problems with racism. We have food banks, and the welfare state is there, but it's not, doesn't mean it's completely free from threats. So just to clarify, what we're trying to do with, let's say in each of the countries, we're showing, well, here's a country-specific notion or concept or way of describing the non-economic benefit of public good. We're trying to be careful not to sort of romanticize these sort of neo-traditional kind of way of, oh, here's this beautiful concept from the past and we can use it to analyze or frame the contribution of higher education. We still have to be critical of them. Maybe perhaps in the case of South Africa, an equivalent would be debates about Ubuntu. To what extent is it genuinely something for everyone, or is it a handy political dressing for the Black elite to use? I think every country has to grapple with this kind of issue. And my own research in Indonesia, the equivalent would be Pancasila. There is this, the philosophical basis for the state, which includes social justice and deliberation, the democratic principles. But this notion of Pancasila has been used both by authoritarian regimes and democratic regimes to justify their own agenda. So it's not the concept or the word in itself that is somehow going to guarantee these amazing higher education policies for us all, but they are a useful tool for us analytically, and they help us when we're doing cross cultural work. They help us to explain and articulate why things are a certain way. So related to that point, and also related to the question from Pete, is about raising public funding. It's about politics, I think, and what I didn't get to show you in today's presentation, something very important happened in post-World War II Finland. Finland was broke because they decided to fight against the Soviet Union. They lost land to the Soviet Union. They were broke. Nevertheless, they decided to embark on the welfare state project, influenced by the economist Gunnar Myrdal from Sweden. And there was political consensus for this. So we have it in the late 40s, early mid 50s, we have a tradition of what we call the punamulta coalition governments. Puna meaning red, referring to the Social Democrats, and multa, referring to soil, referring to the Agrarian League, which was the political party that represented the interests of the non-metropole, the non-Helsinki, the non-Turku, okay, the non-like big cities. And they together, there was political consensus to establish regional universities. The first one was the University of Oulu. So this Humboldtian model, the civilizational university, was extended to various provinces around Finland. So you still get in, a sort of what you might consider sort of a rural agrarian province in Finland, you'll have a research university with high class, STEM research. So this is about political consensus. So going back to Professor Mike Shattuck's point about how can we devolve how can we create this tertiary system in England? I think England needs to reform its political system from a first past the post system to one of proportional representation. And only in this way can you have a diversified political landscape and sphere where, the members of parliament who are in parliament are actually representing a diverse set of interests and regions. I'll stop there.
And I would to say the concepts might be more useful doesn't mean the society's better. They're different questions. I wasn't seeking to advance a kind of Finnish utopia as a sort of positive. That's not the argument. The argument's really about how we reason this out, and what might work across all countries too, which is, the other part of the argument. Where my thinking's gone, Lee, is basically over the 5-year period is that we should emphasise more than we used to, I think, ethics, purpose. I like James Robson's point in the economics panel about the purposeful work. Did you catch that phrase? I thought that was very interesting. And ethical relationships in society and in HE might be more central than we realised, I think, and also educating people for those relationships, which leads to a critique of some of the disciplines which teach arguably bad social ethics.
What you've done today is present us with I think, a fantastic epistemological provocation. I love it. I'm very sad that we have to close down the discussion here, though, because of time limitations. There are some interesting comments in the chat that I think are worth looking through, and Vincent makes a connection to the Republican ideal in practice in the French context as well. So there's our connection between the two.
Excellent paper. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. So
great. You know, I look forward to read like that Finnish case.
Yeah, but I think the lexical comparison between French and English and perhaps French and Finnish is also a really interesting problem as well. Can I just say hello to Wenshi, Fujio, and Hiroshi? Haven't seen you for ages. Really nice to see you in this session.
Great. Okay, well, thank you. Thanks to all three speakers for the brilliant presentations and for this session coming together. Just to the audience, if you joined us late or you want to revisit either of the presentations, there's going to be a recording of the session posted on the CGHE website later today. You can also find their slides or read about projects 7 and 8 there. So as we've run over a little bit, it looks like we're going to be starting the keynote at, well, 4:30 UK time, so 15 minutes from now. It's the final conference event. It's an exciting keynote by Carrie Facer, who'll be talking about the university and social imagination. So we'll see you there shortly. Thanks again, everyone. Bye.
Thanks to the chair.